As I'm overlooking Colonia Tovar, which is an old German settlement from the 19th century here in Venezuela, I can't help to ask myself what happened to Venezuela during World War II, as oil was very important and Venezuela produced a lot of oil. So what happened to this country during the Second World War is what you will find out today. Venezuela gained its independence from Spain in the early 19th century. It spent some time within the borders of the Latin American superstate named Gran Colombia, but seceded from it in 1830. After that, Venezuela passed through an era of government by force, where military dictators ruled, where there were civil wars, and it basically lasted for over a century. From the first decade of the 20th century till 1945, Venezuela was ruled by Juan Vicente Gomez. He ruled as a brutal dictator and focused on modernization of his country. After Gomez's death in 1935, he was succeeded by Eleazar Lopez Contreras. He had been a long-time supporter of Gomez. A transition was set in motion from military to democratic rule. The idea was to transfer power from the military to civilians, but do notice that the military was still very prevalent in the country, hence why a military man was chosen to succeed Gomez. As president, Lopez Contreras introduced significant changes in governmental administration that allowed, among other things, for the founding of new political organizations. Indeed, the foundations of modern political organizations and media, the opening of debates among different ideologies, a greater sensitivity by the government to the various protests and uprisings, and a renewed interest in institutional management all constituted building blocks of a process referred to as democratic learning or evolving democracy. Venezuela had an abundance of oil and gained the attraction of both the Axis and Allied nations. Already in 1933, Nazi Germany showed interest in Venezuela's oil supplies. In Venezuela, the Grupo Regional de Venezuela del Partido Nazi was formed. After this, Germany started a mission to gain access to Venezuela's oil and also provided a military mission to the country to court its military. To counter US economic influence in Venezuela, Germany expanded their holdings in mining, agriculture, and railroads. Italy sold 2 cruisers to the country in 1938, and trade with Japan reached a high in 1939. Some observers claimed that if war would break out, Venezuela would choose the side of the Axis. With German influence expanding, democratically minded politicians in Venezuela started to worry. The long dictatorship of Vicente Gomez only ended recently, and siding with non-democratic Axis nations was not in their best interest. Venezuela's main interest and goal was to keep hold of its own oil supply without it being seized by foreign powers. In an ideal situation, Venezuela would sell oil to both Axis and Allied nations, but it was very unlikely that either side would accept such a situation. As Venezuela sided with Great Britain and the United States, Germany started to target Venezuelan ships in the Caribbean. During World War II, several Venezuelan merchant ships were sunk during the German submarine attack on Dutch Aruba. Also, an unarmed Venezuelan steam tanker was hit. In Venezuela, nearly 4,000 ethnic Germans lived, and Venezuelan politicians started to worry that these might form a fifth column in case of war. They could sabotage, for example, Venezuela's oil facilities. Also, due to Venezuela's proximity to both British, Dutch, and French overseas possessions, they feared that if these would fall in the hands of the Third Reich, Venezuela would be in a precarious situation. The Dutch island of Aruba refined the crude oil that came from Venezuela. If that island would fall into Axis hands, it would be a huge blow for Venezuela. Now, with hindsight, we know that this didn't happen, and it was very unlikely that Germany would seize these territories located so far from Europe, but at that time, all options seemed viable. Apart from danger, the war could also provide opportunities for Venezuela. Venezuela was in need of funds for modernization of its army, for example, and the country saw an opportunity to regain several islands that were ceded to the British. Years before, Britain had seized territory from Venezuela. Recently, this led to a dispute about the Essequibo region in Guyana President Maduro wanted to seize. In the run-up and during World War II, Venezuela also wanted to limit its dependence on foreign oil companies. Eventually, Venezuela decided to remain outwardly neutral, but in reality, they sided with the Allies. A complicated policy that had to be carried out by Venezuela's wartime presidents. Already discussed the first one, Isaías López Contreras, who ruled from 1935 till 1941, and he was succeeded by Isaías Medina Angarita, who ruled from 1941 till 1945. Venezuela's pro-US policy was thanks to the improved relations with the United States. US companies dominated the petroleum industry in Venezuela. Now, the government of Venezuela could have expropriated these possessions, but they feared that the United States might execute an intervention, and the US was no stranger to interventions to its southern neighbors. Now, Mexico did so and got more or less away with it, but Venezuelan politicians never saw this as a viable option. Yet Venezuela did become more assertive towards the US, and the US was very eager to have access to Venezuelan oil. It agreed to increase revenues for Venezuela. Venezuela, on its turn, supported the security plans that were proposed in different Pan-American conferences in Lima, Havana, and Panama. When World War II broke out, Venezuela declared its strict neutrality and continued to trade with both Axis and allied nations. Early 1941, Venezuela strengthened its relationship with the United States. Agreements were signed with the North Americans. They could establish a military base on Venezuelan soil, and also they sent an aviation mission to the country. Soon, Venezuela got help of North American advisors to modernize its military. With the help of the US Navy, Venezuelan tankers were escorted, and the United States also helped with the defense of the Venezuelan refineries. At the end of 1941, the United States got actively involved in the Second World War. Venezuela remained strictly neutral though. Yet Axis accounts were frozen and ships impounded. The military mission of Italy was expelled, and also diplomatic relations were severed. This though did have repercussions. In February 1942, German submarines sunk 7 Venezuelan tankers. Since the Dutch island of Aruba was so important, the Venezuelans and the Dutch signed a pact that agreed on US takeover of the island. With all these measures, Venezuela managed to diminish the German naval threat. But what about German, Italian, and Japanese residents inside Venezuela? In March 1942, the Venezuelan government launched a program to remove suspicious Axis inhabitants from strategic locations. German schools and homes close to these locations, think of ports, power plants, and water mains, they were put under surveillance by the Venezuelan authorities. More strict measures followed in July. The United States encouraged Venezuela to expel all its Axis inhabitants, but the Venezuelan authorities did not agree with that. Eventually, only Axis diplomats were expelled and German sailors were interned. Although Venezuela never had an extensive rail network, a German company with 26 Axis nationals owned 20 miles of railroad. Eventually, the line was expropriated by the Venezuelan authorities in November 1943. As said before, the war provided Venezuelans with opportunities, and Venezuela wanted to make full advantage of these. They managed great leverage over Great Britain. Britain was in need of Venezuelan cooperation in the Caribbean and also in need of its oil. One historian claims that almost all the oil Great Britain used during World War II came from Venezuela. Thus, Venezuela and Britain reached an agreement on the ceding of 2 islands, which gave Venezuela more territory, 2,300 square miles or around 6,000 square kilometers. Venezuela also sought economic assistance for modernization, and in July 1941 they agreed the first land lease deal with the United States. Venezuela occasionally requested aid in the construction of airfields and improvements in the navigation of the Orinoco River instead of military assistance. The government had rightly concluded that if an emergency arose, the United States would provide additional aid for military equipment. And indeed, because when in July 1942 Venezuela made an urgent request to the United States for war materials, this request was granted. Initially, the war had a negative impact on Venezuela's economy because the European markets became cut off. Yet the country did make deals with the United States to strengthen its economy. Its oil economy proved to be pretty fragile, especially after German U-boat attacks on Venezuelan oil ships. Yet as the war continued, Venezuela's oil income increased, and it increased further in the years after World War II. This allowed the country to finance and carry out significant modernization programs in the post-war period. All in all, Venezuela played its cards very well during the Second World War and came out richer, stronger and larger. Thanks to my patrons, you see their names on the screen, and a special thanks to Rainy Bechtel, Thomas Sabiega, Damian Wallace, Connor, Marcus Kaas, Nick Terranova, Mark Littlehill, Justin Trebell, Tanya Dixie, Susanna Di Bella, Fabrizio, Robert Meehan, David A. Chauvet, Wayback History, Michael Prusi, Daniel Holland and Marcus Fielding. Thank you so much for watching. If you want to learn about Colombia during World War II, click here, and click here to learn about the Dutch Antilles during the Second World War. And best wishes from Venezuela.